The sound of the water running in the shower was the only noise in the house, enveloping me in a sense of tranquility that I hadn't felt in a long time. The hot water embraced me, sliding over my skin as if trying to wash away the burden of the last few weeks. I felt tired, empty, as if I were living someone else's life, a life that had never really been mine. I had been married to John for 7 years. We had a quiet life, a house in the suburbs, and everything we had always dreamed of when we first got together. But lately, something had changed. I didn't know if it was habit, routine, or simply that desire had waned, replaced by a sense of detachment that I couldn't explain. John was always busy with work, always away for conferences and meetings. His absence had become almost normal, a ghostly presence that hovered in the empty rooms of our house. And in those absences, I had begun to feel alone, a void that I didn't know how to fill. That day, John was out of town once again, and I had decided to take a morning just for myself. The shower was my refuge, a moment when I could disconnect from everything, relax, and not think. But that morning, as the water slid over me, I heard an unexpected noise. The bathroom door slowly opened. I tensed for a moment, my heart suddenly racing. I thought it was John, that he had come home without telling me. But then I realized it was impossible. He wasn't supposed to be back until... "Sorry, I didn't know you were here." Charles, my father-in-law's voice, caught me by surprise. It was deep, filled with that calm, assured tone he had always had. Charles had become a constant presence in our lives. After his wife died, he had started spending more time with us, perhaps trying to fill the void that solitude had left in his life. He was always attentive, always around, trying to help in any way he could. And that morning it was clear he hadn't heard me come into the bathroom. I tried to cover myself with the nearest towel, my heart pounding from surprise and something else, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. Charles stood there, the door half open, a slight hesitation in his gaze. He was embarrassed, but he also seemed unsure of what to do next. Despite everything, he had always carried himself with dignity and a strength that made him seem unshakable. And at that moment, he was looking at me in a way I had never seen before, a look that made me blush, a mix of embarrassment and something else I couldn't decipher. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Charles said, but he didn't move. He remained there just a few steps from the shower door, and I couldn't look away. There was a strange tension between us, a silence that seemed to scream louder than any words left unsaid. I don't know what pushed me in that moment. Maybe it was the need to feel seen, desired. Maybe it was the void that John had left, asking to be filled by something or someone. But when Charles took a step forward, I didn't pull back. "It's okay," I said, my voice trembling slightly, not even sure why I said it. I wanted him to leave. I wanted him to stay. There was something forbidden in that situation, yet I felt drawn to that sensation, like a moth to a flower. He didn't respond, but he remained there, his gaze fixed on me. I felt enveloped by that tension, as if I were the only person in the world at that moment. I ran a hand through my wet hair, trying to cover myself as much as possible, but Charles moved closer, his eyes never leaving me. "You're beautiful," he murmured, almost under his breath. Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. I hadn't expected them, yet a part of me had longed for them. There was something wrong, profoundly wrong in all of it, but there was also a force pushing me forward, as if I were caught in a current too strong to resist. I looked at him. Our eyes met, and in that gaze I read everything. The desire, the guilt, this awareness that we were crossing a line we could never uncross. Charles took a step forward and reached out a hand toward me, touching my face with a gentleness I hadn't expected, as if he were afraid to break me. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the emotions overwhelming me. But when I reopened them, he was still there, so close that I could feel his breath mixing with the steam of the shower. There were no words needed. Everything happened so quickly, yet every gesture seemed marked by an infinite slowness. His hands moved over my skin with a confidence I had never known. A touch that made me shiver and at the same time feel alive, as if until that moment I had been living in a bubble of apathy. I let myself go to that touch without thinking of the consequences, without reflecting on what I was doing. Charles kissed me with a passion I didn't expect from a man his age, and I responded with a desire that surprised me. The guilt came afterward, a tide that overwhelmed me when it was too late to turn back. I felt like a traitor, dirty but also irreparably tied to that moment. There was no way to erase it, to pretend it hadn't happened. When we pulled apart, we remained there in silence, both aware that we had crossed a line we should never have crossed. Charles looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw a mixture of remorse and desire, as if he too was trapped in this situation with no way out. "I won't say anything," he finally whispered, breaking the suffocating silence. "This stays between us." I nodded without speaking, unable to find the right words. But as Charles left the bathroom, leaving me alone with my thoughts, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. I felt like a child who had just broken a sacred rule, yet there was nothing I could do to make it right. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, with the water still running pointlessly, while a sense of emptiness consumed me from within. From that day on, every time I crossed paths with Charles, that moment resurfaced, a silent ghost that came between us. We never spoke about what happened again, yet I knew we both carried it inside us like an invisible scar that would mark us forever. I returned to my life, to my role as a wife, but nothing was as it had been before. Every time John looked at me, I wondered if he could sense what I had done, if he could intuit the betrayal I had committed in the silence of an ordinary morning. But he never said anything. Maybe he never knew, or maybe he chose to ignore the signs, too caught up in his own affairs to notice the change in me. The weight of the betrayal stayed there, a constant and silent presence that followed me everywhere. And I understood that some lines, once crossed, can never be erased. Life went on, or at least it seemed to. Each day followed another with a familiar and comforting monotony. And yet nothing inside me was the same. The days passed, but that weight remained, like an unconfessable secret that slowly consumed me. Charles returned to his usual routine, always present, always attentive, but with a different look. Every time we crossed paths, there was a silent tension between us, an awareness that made every encounter loaded with meaning, even when we only talked about trivial things. We both tried to act normally. Charles smiled at me with the same cordiality as always, helped John with the housework, and often stayed for dinner as he had always done. But every time our hands accidentally brushed while passing dishes, I felt a jolt running through my body, a mute reminder of what had happened in that bathroom. I was trapped in a cage of conflicting emotions. between the desire to return to that morning and the disgust for myself. One evening, after John had gone to bed, I stayed alone in the kitchen, staring at a glass of red wine. I heard the terrace door open and knew it was Charles, who often came to smoke a cigarette before heading home. His steps were silent, but his arrival had a weight that made me tremble. I did not lift my gaze, but I could sense his presence behind me. "Sophie," he began, his voice low, barely a whisper. I turned slightly, locking eyes with him. There was no need for words, yet I knew that this time we would not avoid what needed to be said. "Charles, we can't go on like this," I said. My voice cracked, heavy with tension. "It's not fair to me, to you, to John." Charles nodded, extinguishing his cigarette in the ashtray with a slow and measured gesture. "I know, but I can't pretend it didn't happen, and neither can you." There was a raw truth in those words, a truth I had tried to deny to myself. "It was a mistake," I said, trying to convince myself, but I knew the truth was much more complex. The mistake wasn't just that moment of weakness, it was everything that had led us there. The loneliness, the dissatisfaction, the desire to feel alive again. Charles took a step forward, and I felt his hand brush my arm, a delicate gesture but loaded with an electric current I couldn't ignore. "Sophie, I know we should stop, but every time I look at you, every time I feel you so close, I can't help but want you." Those words pierced me. I felt my breath hitch, and my heart beat so hard it almost hurt. It was like being trapped in a whirlpool from which I couldn't escape, a mix of attraction and an irresistible urge to let go. "We can't," I repeated, trying to convince myself more than him. But even as I said it, I knew I was just lying to myself. Charles moved closer, his warm breath on my neck making me close my eyes, surrendering for a moment to that feeling that made me feel alive. "I know," he said, and for a moment we looked into each other's eyes, aware that we were on the verge of making another wrong step. But this time, instead of giving in, Charles turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my glass of wine and my broken heart. Days passed, and I tried to focus on other things, work, the house, even friends. But Charles was a constant presence, a thought I couldn't shake. Every time I saw him, I felt that tightness in my chest, a mix of regret and desire. I knew what we had done was wrong. I knew I had to move on. But every time I met his gaze, it all came rushing back, like a wave that overwhelmed me. I was trapped in a reality I could no longer control, trying to hide my pain behind forced smiles and casual words. John suspected nothing, or maybe he chose to ignore it, but I knew I could never forget. The scar that Charles and I had created would remain there, always, like an indelible mark on my soul. One evening, while John was away on a business trip, Charles called me. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Sophie, can we talk?" My first reaction was to refuse, to close that door once and for all, but then I found myself saying yes. An hour later, I was sitting across from him in a small bar far from home, where no one could recognize us. Charles looked at me with an intensity I had never seen before, and for a moment I seemed to see a different man. Not my husband's father, but someone who was trying to make sense of what had happened between us. "I don't know how we got here," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "It wasn't in my plans. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not you." I nodded, feeling the tears sting my eyes. "Neither did I, but we're here and we have to face it." We talked for hours in that hidden bar, trying to find a way to move forward without destroying everything. But every solution seemed wrong. Every step seemed to lead us only deeper into the chaos we had created. Eventually, we decided it would be best to stop seeing each other alone, to avoid situations that could bring us back to that morning. Yet, despite the promises and good intentions, the desire remained, suspended between us like a shadow we could not shake off. Even the most trivial moments were laden with a subtle tension, a casual encounter in the kitchen, a greeting held a moment too long, a glance that lingered just a second more than it should. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was the complicity of two people who had found each other by chance and now didn't know how to let go. Charles understood me in a way that John never did, and this made me feel even guiltier, as if the betrayal wasn't just physical but emotional, something deeper and more devastating. One evening, while I was sorting through some old books, I found a note written by John at the beginning of our marriage. It was full of promises, dreams, and hopes for the future. I read it with tears in my eyes, wondering where we had gone wrong, where I had lost that part of me that loved only him. I decided then that I had to do something to save our marriage. I began making an effort to spend more time with John, trying to rekindle that flame that seemed to have gone out. I organized romantic dinners, weekends away, anything that could bring us closer. John seemed to appreciate my efforts, but there was always a distance between us, an invisible wall we couldn't break down. And Charles was always there, lurking in my thoughts. Even when I was with John, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about that afternoon when everything changed. Months passed, and eventually I realized I couldn't go on like this. The guilt was eating me alive, and no matter how much I tried to make amends, I knew I could never erase what had happened. I had to make a choice, and I knew that whatever decision I made would come at a cost. Eventually, I decided to talk to John. I didn't tell him everything. I couldn't bring myself to confess what I had done with his father. But I told him I felt lost, that I needed to find myself away from everything. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pain, but in the end, he agreed. He took my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the warmth of the love we had shared at the beginning. I left the house for a while, trying to figure out who I was and what I really wanted. It was a difficult time, full of doubts and moments of loneliness, but in the end, I understood that I couldn't keep living in regret and guilt. When I returned, John was there waiting for me, and we decided to start over. One step at a time, without pretending to forget the past, but trying to build a better future. Charles slowly distanced himself, understanding that his presence would only complicate things. There was never a real goodbye between us, just a slow separation that left room for healing. In the end, I learned that betrayals are not just physical acts, but also emotional voids that we try to fill in the wrong way. I don't know if John and I will ever be the way we used to be, but I know that our love is strong enough to endure, at least for now. And for me, that's enough. The story's over, but if you want to hear more stories of secrets and lies, click on one of the videos you see here on the screen, and remember to subscribe to the channel for new intriguing stories every day.